Falkirk, Scotland's greatest UFO mystery. And that's what we're going to cover today, if you will let me, right? A stretch of countryside where ordinary men and women, police officers, forestry workers, engineers, soldiers and families out on an evening drive have all described encounters that challenge everything we think about our world. A place where brilliant lights guide silently through the darkness, where enormous triangular crafts hover quietly over quiet roads, where cars mysteriously lose power, where witnesses speak of missing time, strange beings and memories they cannot fully explain. For decades, these stories have been whispered in pubs, discussed in police stations, debated by scientists and investigated by researchers from around the world. Some obviously dismiss them as coincidence. Others believe they point to something extraordinary. Together, they have given rise to one of Britain's greatest unsolved mysteries, a region simply known as the Fallkirk Triangle. Now, that's nestled between the historic town of Falkirk, Bonnybridge and Stirling, and the villages that dot Scotland's central belt. This seemingly peaceful landscape has earned an astonishing reputation. Few places anywhere in Europe have generated so many reports of unexplained aerial phenomena within such relatively small area. It is a place where history and mystery seem to overlap. Rolling farmland stretches towards ancient woodlands. Old Roman roads disappear into mist-covered hills. Centuries-old castles which watch silently over modern motorways. It is a truly breathtaking place. On first impression, it feels like any other part of Scotland. But spend enough time here and you'll soon discover that the locals speak about their skies differently. For many residents, seeing strange lights has become almost commonplace. Some barely look up anymore. Others remember the exact night their lives changed forever. The area has become so well known for unexplained sightings that many have compared it to America's famous Area 51, while others simply refer to it as Britain's UFO capital. What makes this remarkable isn't simply the number of reports, it's who's making them. They are not all thrill seekers searching for attention. Many witnesses never spoke publicly until years later. Some actively avoided publicity altogether. Among them are police officers trained to observe, pilots who spend thousands of hours studying the skies, military personnel familiar with aircrafts operating above Britain, doctors, teachers, business owners, people with absolutely nothing to gain from sharing stories that many feared would bring ridicule. Yet, despite coming from completely different backgrounds, many describe remarkably similar experiences. Brilliant white spheres that move against the wind, large black triangular crafts that make no sound, objects capable of accelerating in ways that appear impossible, machines unlike any conventional aircraft, and perhaps most unsettling of all, the overwhelming feeling that whatever they witnessed was somehow aware of them. Many describe the same eerie sensation, not simply that they have seen something, but that something has seen them too. The pattern had repeated itself for decades. The reports span generations. Parents who experienced strange lights in the sky in the 1970s would later hear their own children describing similar encounters decades later. Some families have reported multiple sightings over the course of their lives. Neighbours compare stories. Friends quietly admit experiences that they have never dared mention before. Little by little, a picture began to emerge, not of isolated incidents, but of a location where unusual events appear again and again and again. Now, naturally, skeptics often have a more conventional explanation. Scotland's weather can definitely be unpredictable. Temperatures, inversions can create unusual visual effects. Military exercises occasionally bring unfamiliar aircraft into the region. Bright planets, such as Venus, have long been mistaken for UFOs. I think it's more important that skeptics use that as an excuse but I've never bought the Chinese lantern, the weather balloon, or Venus as an excuse for these sightings. Helicopters, viewed under unusual atmospheric conditions, that could go. Every explanation has been proposed, and in many individual cases, one of those explanations may well be correct. But supporters of the mystery argue that conventional explanations struggle to account for the sheer volume of reports accumulated over so many decades. They're not buying that. More importantly, they ask why so many witnesses, unknown to one another, continue describing objects with strikingly similar characteristics. If this was merely a handful of stories, perhaps coincidence could be enough. But we're not talking about a handful. We're talking about hundreds. Some researchers estimated well over 1,000 reports have originated from the wider Falkirk region over the years, with the nearby town of Bonnybridge alone becoming internationally recognised for the frequency of its sightings, and the numbers are extraordinary. For a time, Bonnybridge reported receiving so many UFO reports that journalists from around the world travelled there, hoping to witness something themselves. Television crews arrived, researchers interviewed residents, documentary makers filled hotel rooms. Yet despite all the attention, the mystery only seemed to deepen, because every few months someone else would come forward. Another family, another driver, another lorry driver, another police officer, another account impossible to ignore. Some sightings lasted only seconds, others continued for several minutes. A few witnesses describe experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And among these stories, one stands above every other. And it's the case that transformed a local mystery into an international phenomenon. A case so unusual and so well documented that it remains the only alleged UFO encounter in British history to be officially investigated by police, as though it was a criminal assault. And it happened on a quiet autumn morning in 1979. And I have covered this story, but I will cover it again, right? The witness wasn't searching for flying saucers. He wasn't interested in science fiction. He had no history of strange claims. He was simply going to work, and his name was Robert Taylor. And this is a really famous one. I'm sure you're aware of it, but let's cover it quickly. And what he experienced that morning would forever change the way the world looked at the Fallkirk Triangle. Robert Taylor had followed the same routine for years. At 59 years old, he was a respected forestry worker employed by the Livingston Development Corporation. Friends and colleagues described him as dependable, practical and quiet-spoken. He was the kind of man who believed in hard work rather than tall tales, and he had no interest in becoming famous, no reputation for exaggeration, and certainly no desire to become one of Britain's most famous UFO witnesses. Right, so the morning of November the 9th, 1979, began like countless others. The Scottish autumn had settled over the countryside. A damp mist clung to the ground, hanging between the trees and softening the distant hills into grey silhouettes. Fallen leaves carpeted the forest tracks, while the cool air carried the earthy scent of pine and wet moss. Setting the scene for you there, right? Driving his red pickup through the quiet roads near Dechmont Woods, just outside Livingston, Robert expected nothing more than another ordinary day inspecting the woodland. Nothing about that morning suggested history was about to be made. Now, parking his vehicle beside a familiar forestry track, Robert released his dogs and began walking deeper into the woods. And the forest was unusually still. Many witnesses who later describe extraordinary encounters often recall an odd silence beforehand. Bird songs disappear. The wind even seems to stop. Even familiar woodland sounds somehow fade away. Now, whether this is a coincidence or simply how the human mind remembers dramatic moments remains open to debate. I think it's a side effect of whatever he's seeing. But Robert would later describe the woods as feeling strangely quiet. Now, as he climbed a small rise, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be an unusual agricultural vehicle or a wrecked tractor. Partially obscured by trees and mist sat a large metallic object, unlike anything he has ever seen before. He said it wasn't resting naturally on the ground. Instead, it appeared to hover just above the forest floor. Now, Robert estimated it measured around 20 feet across. Its shape was difficult to describe. It resembled a giant metal dome with a rough sandpaper-like texture. Around its outer edge protruded a series of spherical structures, almost like large mines or mechanical buoys attached to its body. The object made no obvious engine noise, no propellers, no exhaust, no visible means of flight. It simply hovered there silently in front of him. Now, for several moments, Robert simply stared, trying to understand what he was seeing. He thought they weren't aliens. He later suggested it might be some kind of secret military equipment. Now, after all, Britain was deep into the Cold War then. Experimental technology wasn't impossible. But as he cautiously stepped forward, events took a terrifying turn. Right, without warning, two smaller objects detached themselves from beneath the craft. He's still standing there, right? They dropped silently towards the ground before moving directly towards him. Now, Robert later described them as spiked spheres, each appearing to be covered in metal rods or spikes resembling sea mines. And I'm sure if you picture that, you can imagine. They didn't roll across the woodland floor, they glided. They glided smoothly as well, purposely, in fact, he said, straight towards Robert. Now, before Robert had time to react, the strange machines accelerated. He felt sharp pain shooting through his leg as though something had gripped him. He later believed the objects had somehow attached themselves to his trousers, and the sensation was overwhelming. He struggled desperately to escape. Instinctively, he turned and tried to run. As you would. Then everything went black, right? No gradual fading, no confusion. You know, he didn't feel himself drifting off. He simply passed out. Right, so everything went to black, nothing. The next thing Robert remembered was standing alone, and the metallic craft had vanished. The strange spheres were gone as well. The forest was once again silent. Confused and shaken, he looked around. At first, he wondered whether he had just fainted. Perhaps he had suffered some kind of medical episode. But you know that something isn't right. His clothes, for a start, were badly damaged. The knees of his trousers were torn, and his jacket was dirty. His body also ached as well. As he tried to collect himself, another disturbing realisation dawned on him. His dog was nowhere to be seen. Now, thank God, eventually the animal returned, but according to Robert, it behaved nervously, almost refusing to approach him. Now, whether the dog had sensed danger or simply become frightened by the commotion is impossible to know. But still shaken, Robert slowly made his way back to his vehicle. When he reached the pickup, he noticed something else. He was covered in mud, or more importantly, he had absolutely no memory of how he ended up back near the road. Now, the journey through the woods was simply missing. Right, so, as I say, he had no idea how he got to the truck. The journey through the woods was simply missing. Now, as he climbed into the cab and started the engine, Robert became increasingly aware that something terrible had happened. He wasn't imagining his injuries. His clothing had genuinely been damaged, and his body genuinely hurt. His memory generally contained a blank period he couldn't explain. So, deciding something was seriously wrong, he drove home. His wife Mary immediately noticed his distressed appearance. She later recalled that Robert looked pale, confused and deeply shaken. This wasn't a man telling an excited story. This was someone who appeared genuinely traumatised, concerned for his welfare, she contacted the police. Now, what happened next would make the case unique in British history. Rather than dismissing Robert's account outright, officers decided to investigate. Now, when detectives accompanied him back to Dechmont Woods, they expected to find little, to be honest. Instead, what they did is they discovered physical evidence. At the location Robert identified, investigators found a series of unusual impressions pressed deep into the soft ground. The mark appeared consistent with something heavy having a rest or hovered over the area. Now, nearby, they also documented strange track-like impressions leading away from the vegetation. Police actually photographed the site, measures were taken and statements were recorded. The investigation was conducted not as a UFO inquiry, but as a possible assault. Well done to the police, right? After all, Robert claimed unknown object had physically attacked him. His torn clothes and visible injury supported that fact. What that something actually was, though, no one could explain. Right, a medical examination found scratches and abrasion consistent with his account of being dragged through rough woodland, but there was no evidence of hallucination, right? No evidence of alcohol, no sign that Robert had invented the story. Psychologists who later evaluated the case found no indication that he had suffered from mental illness or had fabricated the experience for attention, and that's really important. In fact, those who knew him often repeated the same observation. If anyone had told this story, Robert Taylor would have been among the first people to go, not believing that. Over the years, investigators have proposed numerous explanations. Some suggested that Robert may have suffered a brief epileptic seizure or another medical event before falling into the undergrowth, with his confused mind filling in the missing details afterwards. Others argued that unusual forestry machinery seen through dense mist might somehow have triggered mistaken interpretation. Okay, skeptics also point out that memory is remarkably fragile, particularly following trauma. Yet none of these theories comfortably explain every aspect of the case. The physical ground markings, for one, you can't fake that. The torn clothing, the missing time, or perhaps more importantly, Robert's unwavering consistency. Until the day he died in 2007, he never changed his account. He never sought financial gain, and that is really important. Never attempted to turn himself into a celebrity. He simply maintained that he had described exactly what had happened. Now, whether one believes his story or not, the Robert Taylor encounter remains one of the most compelling and carefully documented UFO cases ever reported in the United Kingdom. And its impact was profound. Word spread quickly across Scotland, then across Britain, then around the whole world. Suddenly, people began looking more closely at the skies above central Scotland. Researchers started comparing old reports. Journalists began interviewing local residents, and something remarkable emerged, right? Robert Taylor's encounter wasn't an isolated incident, far from it. As investigators dug deeper into the history of the region, they discovered dozens of witnesses describing strange aerial phenomena years before 1979. And even more intriguing, the sightings didn't stop after Robert's experience. If anything, they became more frequent. And you know why that is the case? Because more people took notice. Within just a few years, one small Scottish town will find itself at the centre of an international UFO mystery, a place where unexplained objects appeared with such astonishing regularity that many would come to call it the UFO capital of Scotland. And that town was Bonnybridge, right? After Robert Taylor's remarkable encounter, many assumed the story would eventually fade into history. Like so many unexplained events, it will be discussed for a few months, debated in newspapers, and gradually disappear from public memory. But that isn't what happened. Instead, something curious began to unfold. More people started coming forward. Some claimed that they had seen strange objects years before Robert's experience, but had never spoken publicly, fearing ridicule or disbelief. And mate, that must happen all the time. Others described entirely new encounters. And as the years passed, investigators noticed an unsettling pattern. These sightings were not spread evenly across Scotland. Again and again, reports clustered within the same relatively small region. Now, the area stretching between Falkirk, Stirling and Cumbernauld and the village of Bonnybridge seemed to produce an extraordinary number of unexplained aerial sightings, and it's become known as the Fallkirk Triangle. No one can say with absolute certainty who first coined that name, but once it appeared, it stuck. The Fallkirk Triangle, because the more researchers examined the reports, the more remarkable the statistics became. While exact figures vary depending on the source, local researchers have estimated that over the years, hundreds, and by some accounts, well over 1,000 unexplained sightings have been reported from within that small area. Now, there is an astonishing concentration for a region of its size. Of course, numbers always prove very little. Once an area gains a reputation for UFO sightings, people may become more inclined to report unusual lights that might otherwise be ignored. And like I say, they're looking more, right? Psychologists call this an unexpectancy effect. If you expect to see something strange, you're more likely to interpret an unusual event as something mysterious. And I do get that. I can't disagree with that. Skeptics argue this may explain at least part of the Fallkirk Triangle's reputation. And yeah, okay, let's buy that. Doesn't explain it all. It's a reasonable argument, isn't it? Yet believers counter with a question of their own. How did the reputation begin in the first place? Now, that's a fantastic one, right? And why do so many descriptions remain strikingly similar across decades? Now, by the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, one location had become almost synonymous with unexplained sightings, and that was the small town of Bonnybridge. Today, Bonnybridge appears much like any other Scottish community. Rows of houses line quiet streets. Local businesses serve familiar faces. Children walk to school beneath the sky. On most days they seem perfectly ordinary. Nothing about the town suggests it should occupy a unique place in UFO history. Yet ask long-time residents and many will tell you they have witnessed something unusual themselves, or at least know someone who has. For a period during the 1990s, reports began so frequent that local newspapers struggled to keep up. One week it will be a strange light over nearby fields. The next, a silent triangular craft hovering above a country road. Then, an ominous glowing sphere drifting effortlessly across the sky before accelerating away at impossible speeds. The description varied, but certain details remained time and time again. Objects that moved without making any sound. Lights capable of changing direction instantly. Crafts that appeared far larger than conventional aircrafts. And above all, the silence. Right? Witness after witness remarked upon it. Even large objects, some estimated to be hundreds of feet across, produced no engine noise whatsoever. For many observers, the silence proved more disturbing than the appearance of the craft themselves. Several witnesses described standing beneath enormous dark shapes. Not a single sound, only an eerie stillness. One local resident later recalled driving home late one evening when an enormous triangular object appeared above the road ahead. Now, according to his account, the craft seemed to almost absorb the surrounding darkness. Only small lights at each corner revealed its outline against the night sky. Now, he estimated it remained overhead for several seconds before silently gliding away. There was no sonic boom, no jet engine, no helicopter rotors, only complete silence. Now, another witness described watching a brilliant white sphere hanging motionless above open countryside. For several minutes it remained perfectly still, and then without warning it shot away at a tremendous speed and disappearing into the distance within seconds. They said there was no gradual acceleration, no visible propulsion, just instant movement that appeared to defy conventional flight. Were these accurate observations? Or were they optical illusions? Were they misidentified aircrafts? No one can say for certain. But look, I don't believe they're optical illusions, and they are certainly not misidentified aircrafts, because it's that silence. Yet investigators noticed another recurring feature. Many witnesses were entirely alone when the encounters occurred. They had little reason to invent elaborate stories that invited ridicule from neighbours, colleagues and even family members. As you would imagine, some never reported their experiences officially. Instead, their accounts only emerged years later during interviews with researchers. The reluctance to say something is often overlooked. Publicity claiming to have seen a UFO rarely brings admiration. More often, it invites skepticism, laughter, and possibly even losing your job. Questions about your mental health. For many witnesses, remaining silent would have been the easier choice, and yet they spoke anyway, risking everything. Perhaps because what they experienced left such a lasting impression that keeping it secret became impossible. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Bonnybridge report is the sheer variety of people involved. Among them were experienced drivers, accustomed to judging distance and speed, tradesmen returning home after late shifts, families travelling together. They're great, families are great, right? Retired military personnel, again a very good witness. Each individual who openly admitted they had never believed in UFOs until witnessing something they could not explain. They weren't gatherings of enthusiasts skirting the sky with telescopes. Most sightings occurred unexpectedly during completely ordinary moments. Like you say, driving home from work, walking the dog, taking out the rubbish, looking through a bedroom window before going to sleep. Moments that suddenly became unforgettable. And that is important, isn't it? That is really important. These are just normal, everyday people going about their normal life and seeing something weird. Now, as reports increased, journalists from across Britain and eventually from overseas began arriving in Bonnybridge. Some hoped to witness a sighting themselves. Others simply wanted to understand why this quiet Scottish town seemed to attract so much attention. Television documentaries were filmed, newspaper articles appeared across Europe, researchers established observations, night after night cameras were pointed towards the sky. Sometimes they captured unusual lights, often they captured nothing at all. Yet despite the growing scrutiny, the reports continued. Not every witness described structured crafts. Some spoke only of lights. Others described glowing orbs moving in formation. Occasionally, several lights appeared to merge into one before vanishing. Were they motherships? At other times, a single brilliant object seemed to divide into multiple smaller lights, each travelling in a different direction. Again, is that a mothership? These descriptions fascinated investigators because they appeared to repeat themselves across separate witness accounts. Could they all be observing unusual atmospheric phenomenon? I don't think so. Could they all be experiencing experimental aircrafts? No, I don't think they did. Astronomical objects viewed under scrutiny, unusual conditions, because that is, they always say Venus, don't they? Every possibility had been explored and none had explained every report. Perhaps even stranger than the sightings themselves were the emotional reactions they produced. Many witnesses described an overwhelming sense of calm. Others reported tense fear that seemed out of proportion to what they were actually observing. Several spoke of feeling watched, not by another person, but whatever was occupying that strange craft above them. It's an unsettling detail that appears in UFO reports from around the world. Now, as researchers compared witness statements, another disturbing pattern slowly emerged. A surprising number of people claimed that something about their experience didn't quite add up. Their watches appeared to show more time had passed than they remembered. Journeys that should have taken 15 minutes somehow lasted an hour. Simple drive home contained unexplained gaps. Now, most dismissed these incidents, but others couldn't, because those missing minutes would become one of the most controversial aspects of the Fallkirk Triangle mystery. Some researchers suggested stress and shock distort our perception of time. Others pointed towards fatigue, daydreaming, or simple forgetfulness. Yet a small number of investigators proposed a far more extraordinary possibility. What if these missing moments weren't simply forgotten? What if they had been taken? Now, it's an idea that has fueled UFO folklore for decades, and I am a massive believer in alien abductions. And while there is no conclusive evidence to support such claims, stories of missing time will become increasingly common among those reported close encounters within the Fallkirk Triangle. Now, whatever the explanation, by the end of the 1990s, the reputation of this quiet corner of Scotland has become firmly established. The Fallkirk Triangle was no longer viewed as the location of one famous encounter. It had become something far larger, a place where unexplained events seem to repeat themselves generation after generation. And perhaps the most compelling aspect of all, some of the most convincing witnesses were yet to come. Because when trained observers, people whose careers depend on accurately identifying aircraft, began describing impossible objects of their own, even the skeptics were forced to pay attention. Now, after Robert Taylor's remarkable encounter, many assumed the story would eventually fade into history. Like so many unexplained events, they would be discussed, debated, and gradually disappear. But that didn't happen, because we are still talking about the Fallkirk Triangle today. Something curious began to unfold in Falkirk. Many people started coming forward, right? And the story's still going today. So what do you think, the Fallkirk Triangle? Have you had any experiences yourself? You know, and I've not been to Bonnybridge. I've been that way. And when I get the opportunity, I'm going to do the NC 500, and I'm generally going to visit it myself. But if you have had any sightings or situations that you would like to discuss and put in the comments, and please do so. Well, this was UFO Aliens and Weird Stuff. I really appreciate you sticking around. Thanks for staying tuned, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.